So thank you guys for attending today. For those that are in the room, we do have a sign-in sheet and we have some slides back there. I also have half sheets for if you need CEs through WVU. Feel free to take one of those and fill that out and just drop it in the box on your way out. For those on Zoom, if your name's not currently showing as a participant, please go ahead and type that in. I just want to make sure everyone gets credit for attending today. We have Lisa. I'm going to try to do my Italian, but it's not very good. I'm going to say it, okay? Fornaresio, and I know you have to do this, right? So she is the Director of Research and Quality at the Heart and Vascular Institute. She has over 20 years experience. Did you have to add that up for that, or you were like, that's a lot of numbers, right?
I feel old.
Yeah, I feel old.
That's what happens.
We'll just have you turn your mic on too once you get started. So then that 20 years experience is in academic research and also a research administrator. She has multiple disciplinary teams with all phases. So coming from a really vast background here, scientifically, her expertise is in both quantitative and qualitative research methodology. As a medical sociologist, her own research, she's really focused on the quality of life, health, outcomes, and risk factor assessments. And that's for cardiovascular and liver disease. So let's get to the fun facts. Who wants the fun facts, right? I like the fun facts. I don't know if you want this fun fact. You may not want this one. She's originally from Ohio, so she is a Buckeye. Okay, so there's that. But she has a stray cat she took in and she named him Freddie Mercury. So there, yeah, right? Mix up for the Buckeye, right? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Can you hear me? Is it projecting? Okay. I apologize because I'm a little under the weather, over the weather, I don't know. So anyway, welcome. Thank you. How's everyone doing? It's Friday, so that's good, right? Yes. Ready for the weekend. Everybody, I see familiar faces, some unfamiliar faces. So I'm here to talk about medical device research. I'm going to do my best to bring some information that might be new to some of you, but also to open some discussion for those that are doing medical device research. How we can always continually better the process. There's a lot of new processes being implemented in the WVU community, so I think it's affecting all of us in one way or another, not just in medical device research, but across the research community. So, and I have a lot of my team here as well. I see Connie, Raquel, Katerina, Chad, Melissa, I think Sean and Mike might be via Zoom. So they might pipe up too if I forget something with my brain fog or something that they know that would be important. So how many people actually, just get to give a show of hands, how many people are familiar or doing medical device research? Okay. So what other types of research? So drug studies, I'm guessing. Academic projects, other clinical type things that don't involve devices. Okay, just so I can get an idea. Okay, so the objective obviously is to basically address things to think about when doing medical device research, and some of the things that I've learned over the years, as well as being fairly new to the WVU community. I arrived at WVU, it'll be 3 years in January. I can't believe it's been 3 years because I still feel like I'm in some regards new, and because the community has grown so much in the face of WV medicine. I'm on the WV medicine side. I'm housed in the Heart and Vascular Institute, and so as you all know, we've grown astronomically. So I still feel like I'm new in a lot of regard and working through a lot of the processes for research. So prior to coming to WVU, I was in Northern Virginia in a health system there for a long time. And there's a lot of similarities. I mean, health system to health system, but there's also a lot of, there are some differences. But at the end of the day, research is research. So most of the things that we're powering through for medical device research here are not necessarily surprising. It's the different policies of this institution versus the previous one. This is a little different too, because we have the university and the research corp, and that kind of triangulation that can sometimes, question like which direction we need to go or who we need to involve. Okay, so I'm going to, just for the sake of giving some context to medical device research, I want to talk a little bit about industry-sponsored trials and investigator-initiated trials / also government funding, because a medical device could be used in any of those contexts, and some similarities across those processes, but also some differences. So I just want to give some context and not just assume everybody is talking about industry-sponsored research or knows, what that difference is. So industry-sponsored research, typically funded by an outside company. So in oncology, it's like the big pharma companies. We have a lot of devices. We have a decent amount of drug studies as well. Boston Scientific, Merck's, Medtronics, those type of companies that actually are the ones that are making the devices. So we're basically contracted to do the study. The intellectual property is not ours. We are basically paid to do the study. That data goes back to that company. We don't own that data as intellectual property. Those devices, they're made by the company. We don't have any claim to anything really as far as intellectual property. There could be numerous sites around the world, the country. If it's an early feasibility study, it could be very few sites. So, we've got the drugs and the devices. So with drugs, you're used to hear phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, those types of terminology. With devices, some people kind of consider them in phase 1, phase 2, but it really is not meant. Those terms were really developed for drug studies. So with devices, you often see like early feasibility studies or pivotal studies. So early feasibility would typically be like a first in human. It may go from an animal model to a human model, or it might still be very early on in the human population for that device. Pivotal and post-marketing, or as the device goes through that process and gets different approvals, it'll move through kind of like drugs do as they start to get bigger. They start in a small sample size, very close contact with the FDA. There's a lot of back and forth. They have to do strictly, get the FDA's approval for any little change to a sentence in the protocol. I mean, it's very, very strict in those early feasibility studies. And then as the trial moves through, just like the drugs do, you'll see the bigger sample sizes, that you'll see more sites involved, more patients enrolled. And at some point, that device will move from basically not standard of care, really, to being more standard of care and covered by CMS, et cetera. So you kind of follow that device as you go through, and then registries, but we're not going to talk about that. So investigator-initiated trials are what I call, these are your homegrown studies where our investigators or an investigator at another site, it's their idea. So their intellectual property, it's theirs. They're the one who came up with the study. They proposed the study. They're responsible for, outlining everything to do for the study. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight the difference between the two, because with industry-sponsored trials and medical devices, just like drug trials and everything, you get everything hand-delivered to you typically from the sponsor. You get your binders, you get your checklists, you get your CRFs, you get all of that. It's very clear when you're supposed to draw that lab. It's very clear when that device is going to be utilized. It's very, very clear because these are coming from sponsored trials. With investigator-initiated research, the onus is on the investigator. So if you're doing an investigator-initiated trial that involves a device, you're the one, or your team or your investigator has to think of everything. When is the device being used? How are you making sure you have device accountability? Like, all the onus is on you. Now, investigator-initiated research could still be funded by an outside company, because often investigators will apply to programs within these big device companies and get grants from them. But it's still, the onus is on the investigator and the site as far as the regulatory. I mean, you have to come up with your own serious adverse event forms and, you know, your device accountability and tracking. There's typically no EDC that you enter all this in, and nobody automatically ships you a device when you enter that you used one. So the reason I point that out is because they are very different. They could still be using the same device, but if one's investigator initiated versus industry sponsored, it's going to be a very different experience. And you need to consider all that when you're talking about resources and coordinator support and, you know, a lot of times going back and forth with the PI to even hone their idea about, because, you know, we know PIs, they're often big thinkers. And then they want us to figure out how to execute it, right? So they have the idea, and it's often a lot of back and forth with an investigator-initiated trial to really understand what they want when they see the data at the end, to make sure that you've done what you need to along the way. And involving devices, then now you could be implanting someone in a device in someone, and we need to make sure that we have everything in place. Okay. And then federally funded research trials are really, the only reason I kind of put them in their own bin is because we all know that there's a lot of additional hoops to jump through if you're federally funded through the NSF or NIH or something like that. So again, if you're doing a device trial and it's funded through one of these mechanisms, it's going to look a little differently as far as the contracts and you know, maybe the stipulations on the devices or the reporting mechanisms. So again, same device could be used in any one of these trials, but the things that go into, some of the things that go into it are going to be different. And obviously a lot of them will be the same. Okay, so industry sponsored research, I'm really going to focus on that because I think that's that's the bulk of what we're doing. B, I think the process that we'll talk about will be similar regardless of what mechanism you're going, as far as how do you really get devices in the WVU campus and start a trial and set yourself up to be successful. And I know, so I'm going to talk about this, and this is how we're set up in HVI. So I have these little boxes that I do for who's involved in the process. So whenever we intake a study, for the purposes of this, a medical device study, the people that are going to be involved in those process as the study moves through the life of that study. So for us, we have a steering committee. Our division chiefs sign off on everything that goes on in our institute. So the principal investigator, the division chief, the steering committee, and then myself basically all assess the study when it comes in the door. So we get a notification through that a PI wants to do a medical device study. It basically goes to the steering committee, and the steering committee moves it forward. Then it will start to move into this process. So some of the things that we start to talk about are the buy-in from the clinical staff. Devices, you know, for us, could be in the cath lab or in the OR or maybe even on the unit, depending on, or they may start with a device and it may transition with the patient from the OR up to the CVICU. So we start to think about the clinical staff. What areas are these impacting? Because it's going to also start a lot of conversation that we're going to talk about, which are these devices and how to make sure that they don't get confused with standard of care devices and the device accountability. And when they come in, things like the loading dock and somebody opens your box and it was for research and now you can't find those devices. And they're like, well, we just sent them to the cath lab with all the other devices. So these are the real world things that you have to think about that we're still actually, that just came up last week. And we're like, what, you never opened our boxes for the last 3 years. Why did you open the box now? And now we can't find the devices. This is not a good thing, right? So now we have to put all this in place too. Other things like scientific merit, but that's across everything. Feasibility, resources, costs of devices. This is a thing that I'm going to talk about through the rest of the presentation, are the costs of devices and why that's important, and the different things and people that you have to pull into that conversation. other types of significance, and then confidentiality agreements, et cetera. So then we start to move in, the study's been approved, we're gonna move into the study, into the budget negotiation and legal review. And one thing I wanna say too is I know we track our metrics as far as the initial time that we get approached by a sponsor and we get an NDA in place to the time that we do various milestones. So IRB submission, IRB approval, contract submission of the contract to OSP, contract fully executed, days to enrollment. A lot of the things that Encore, I know a lot of you are using Encore and we're up and coming and using Encore. I know a lot of those things Encore tracks, and we certainly have been tracking those metrics as well, because that's another key to success, right? Is if we get a study come in and then it takes us 8 months to get the study up and running, the likelihood of our success could be low. Or if we open a study and we haven't enrolled. So we're tracking all this. And one of the reasons I point this out is because there's a lot of things that come in with medical devices that can hold up your study. And so as soon as you know that you're going to be doing a study for devices, the sooner that that process starts, the better, because they can, just by the nature, and it's not a bad thing, it's not a criticism of any part in that process. One thing I'll say is there's a lot of change at WVU Medicine with IT, with procurement, with biomed. There's a lot of changes going on there that they have recently, over the last couple years, really been kind of upping the bar. And so we're finding out those as we go. So there's not even a cheat sheet that I can say, like, here's a checklist. There's an overview of, like, these are the kind of key players that you need to make sure you involve if you're bringing a device on campus. But a lot of those processes are still being worked out by those departments. So it makes it very much like a moving target. But it can affect your metrics. So if we're tracking and we're like, oh man, we got everything we got the IRB in and our contract got executed, but we're still sitting around trying to get the device on the facility or checked out by biomed, and we could have started the study a month ago, but we haven't been able to get it cleared by biomed, then now we're kind of stuck, right? So during the budget negotiation and the legal review of the contract, this is obviously, we all know, where you dive in, do a lot of the specifics. We know the schedule of events is like our Bible, right, for studies. It tells us exactly what we need to be doing on these patients. So this is also where, from the business perspective, we will look at how much the device costs. Is it standard of care? Is the company providing it for free? It depends on the study. Sometimes the devices are provided as part of the study. Sometimes we're actually looking at a study now that it's basically a standard of care device, but there's an upcharge to it because it's like the new version of the standard of care device. Well, that adds $2,000, say, to a case. So I could just, in my research, be like, sure, that's fine. Like, what do I really care, right? It's not coming out of my pocket. But then the director of the cath lab or the OR is going to come and say, wait, my cost center just got dinged, because you guys enrolled 20 patients at $2,000 in upcharge. Now she's got, that money coming out of her cost center because it's a standard of care device. So these are all the things like that you think, oh, well, like it doesn't necessarily really matter. Like, I'm sure insurance will pay for it, or I'm sure, well, you can't be sure of any of that. So that's when you also, assess, is there CMS coverage? Is it standard of care? Is it standard of care with an upcharge? How many cases do you think you're going to do? The other point I'll make about that is with procurement is the hospital has contracts with Boston Scientific or Edwards or some of these companies. If we take on a study, say with a competitor's device, and we unknowingly enroll enough patients that violates the contract that the hospital has with that vendor, they can lose millions of dollars in their rebates or hundreds of thousands of dollars in their rebates. I don't want to be responsible for that, right? So that's the thing is we could say, oh, well, this is a research device. We're going to get this in, Molly and her team do the CTA, we get, procurement to weigh in on a like device amount. So everything's said and done. But if I don't pull in the operational people from an operation perspective to find out that, that could ding their cost center, then we could have a problem, right? They're going to have to report variances to finance and on all of this stuff. So one of those things lesson learned, right? Long time ago, it happened. I was new and I was like, well, we're going to do this study. And it ended up being like $150,000 coming out of a clinical cost center. They weren't that happy about that. I get it. Never did that again, right? That I know of anyway. So those are all the things that when you're in these early phases, it's better to have those conversations very early on. Most of the people that we've worked with in all these departments, we just started reaching out and saying, I'm not going to pretend I know procurement or how they do their contracts or how their contracts are negotiated. We have a study right now that we do. We have to keep the enrollment under a certain number of cases per month, because if we go over that many in a quarter, we violate that contract, and then they could potentially lose rebates, and cost centers can be affected. So these are definitely things to think about. And I don't know, hospital finance is not my thing either. So you just start pulling in all the people, that you can think of that would know those answers. And everybody's been great and collaborative, because they also have a vested interest. It's their cost center, it's their procedure area. And also at the end of the day, it's their clinical teams. And, one thing I think we all learn is clinical teams really want to be in the know about the research that's going on in their area. We're often an extra step for a study. We're that extra set of labs that a nurse has to draw at the end of her 12-hour shift or her 15-hour shift. We're 30 minutes extra on a case that maybe an OR team has to stay after because we're implanting a device and the device takes 30 minutes longer. So we are an extra thing. And so clinical teams really do want to know what's going on, and they want to be collaborative. They just like to be in the know. And then storage of study files, but more so storage of study devices, right? So where are we storing these devices? Does it have to be temperature controlled? Are there, because some of the valves that we do in cardiovascular, there's certain temperature requirements for that. Some of the devices have canisters on them of explosive things that I'm a sociologist, I'm not clinical, so I call it an explosive thing. That always is like, I tiptoe around to make sure I don't make it explode. So those types of things, where are you going to store that? Who's going to have access to that? That has to be locked. It has to be multiple secured. We can't have a research device going in someone for a standard of care case, right? And that's happened. It's not happened here, but in my previous life, and it does happen, right? So you've got the research valves over here, and you've got the standard of care valves over here. And in the moment, the surgeon says, hey, give me blah, 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 and somebody pulls it. And now you've just put an investigational device in someone that didn't sign an informed consent. That's not cool, right? We can't be doing that. So where are you going to store them? Who's going to have access? We do it very strictly. Our devices are stored only under our purvey. Our PIs do not have access to any of our devices. It's our coordinators coordinate everything for the days of cases. They do inventory control. Our team does device accountability, does reorder, like all of that. So we lock it down that it's almost impossible for that to happen. But you have to have the space, you have to have the temperature control, you have to have all those things in place. And then the pricing agreements, so disposables and consumables, not just the device, but a lot of our pricing agreements when we're in this early phase for these devices, you have the medical device, but you have all the things that go with that. Is there a launcher for the valve? Is there a cannula for this? And if that patient is going into that study only for research, oftentimes that cannot be billed to their insurance, because if it's not standard of care, then the study needs to pay for it. So these are all the things that you have to think about when you're budgeting, to make sure that anything that is not standard of care, if that patient was not in this study and they're having these things done, we need to make sure that we then also don't commit Medicare or insurance fraud and bill to their insurance when we're also getting reimbursed by the study. So all of these things have to be ironed out very early on before that device is even received by us. And we do a lot of that work with procurement. So Debbie McQuaid and her team, I know it kind of works its way in with Molly and Tiffany and maybe Katie Dean as far as getting rolled up into the master contract. But Debbie McQuaid is the one who's really been our, voice of saying, okay, wait, we have this contract with so-and-so, and we can't violate that if we go above so many cases. So we just pull her into anything now device related. And then we are going to do, so then we have IRB submission. That's just all general stuff, pre-study activities, imaging orders, that kind of stuff. But then this is where, as far as devices, the storage and accountability. So about this phase, we may actually start receiving devices from companies. If we've got IRB approval, or sometimes they start sending stuff, you know how companies are, right? They just start sending stuff. They get one person's name and they bombard that person, and you just start receiving stuff that you don't even know what to do with it yet. So you start getting all of this. Where are you going to store them? You have to check them in. Different systems. Some of them use EDCs for logging devices that come in. Some of them it's as simple as paper and pencil, which you're always a little nervous about. And then this is when you start to have to think about biomed. So are you guys familiar with biomed? How many people are familiar with like biomed? Kind of, sort of. Okay. So biomed is a department, I guess, in the hospital, and they check medical devices that are going to be used on patients. Now, if it's an implantable, they're not going to look at it, right? So they don't care about implantables because you're implanting it in and there's that piece. But things like an EKG machine that you have with your study, or for instance, we actually have an early feasibility study, and this is a really cool study. I'm looking at Connie because we're like really trying, but we have a study that is first in human. And we are one of, I guess now 4 or 5 centers in the US that are doing this study. And this device came in and it was built by an engineer. Like, he put some parts together. I'm gonna dumb this up a little bit. He put some parts together and built this machine. It doesn't come out of a catalog. It doesn't have a loss-in number, which is what the hospital is. What's the loss-in number? I don't know. It doesn't have one. It was like built in the garage. I mean, I'm right. It was built in their facility and it was shipped to us. And Chad's like, how do I take this down to biomed? Like, they're not even going to know what it is. It's not an EKG machine. It's a, I don't even know how to explain it. I mean, Connie could. It's a pump type system that is used to occlude the SVC of patients who are not diuresing well, okay? But it's never been used before in humans. Like, they went from animal, little rats, mice, to humans. So Chad shows up in biomed with this device and is like, well, I'm here to have you check it out, but like, I don't know how to tell you what it does, or, and that's just one of those things. Like, we got activated, they wanted to do a case, and then we're like, oh my gosh, we need to get this, like, you're used to like an EKG machine coming in, they plug it in, they make sure the lights light up and everything. Well, I don't know. I mean, so that was a process, and actually it came not put together. So it came in pieces. So Chad's like, shows up with all the pieces. It's like, can you do anything? Then the engineer had to come or get on Skype with Chad. They had to put the machine together, and you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to be used on a patient. Like, I mean, we pulled it off. It's all fine. We have a backup device too, because that's the other thing. You typically don't just want one of these things that's keeping someone alive. You want two, right? So it all worked out well, but it did add some time to our process. It added some stress to our process. And it was a good reminder, like, we don't know what we don't know. And we certainly want to pull other people in that can at least weigh in or help, or because we also don't, what if we just took that device and started using it on the patient and no one checked it, right? And there was a electrical short, or, something that nobody could have planned for. And we don't certainly want that to happen. So these things that have to be, basically biomed needs to check anything that's going to be used on a patient. Not implanted in a patient, but used on a patient. So even if there's like a glucose machine, or like a bedside testing for glucose or something like that, or INR, something like that, those types of things they do have to check. And then we have the other side. Some of these devices, not as much the implantables, but some of the things that go with device research, and I'm just plugging it for IT because we've run into a lot of issues, is, is IT approval for anything that would have patient information in it, right? So even like iPads that you're using in studies, and I know iPads can go across more than just a device study, but if you're using an iPad to collect information, IT at WV Medicine now, I mean, there's a whole process. There's like I don't know how long that form is. Seems like it's 20 or 30 pages, but it's not. No, we have a study with a Italian place, and there's even just a website that the PI has to log into. We couldn't get the software downloaded. They sent the questionnaire to the Italian people, which I thought was funny because I'm sure these Italian people are looking at this questionnaire going, I have no idea what you're talking about. But some of the devices, if they're collecting information and they're being used on the patient, there's a fairly new process that is been launched, and it delays our timeline because we cannot just assume that we can use this iPad to consent a patient, or that this other device that may be pumping or doing something with the patient but is also receiving and collecting that information. IT wants to verify, is it connecting to the network? How is that information stored on that device? Now obviously implantables are different. So if you're getting an implantable, meaning like a valve procedure, that's going to go in you. They're going to document that in Epic with the serial number. All of that's going to be documented in the patient's chart. So at any time, if there was an issue with that valve, they would be able to pull from a database and locate the patients that have that. But some of these other devices that are not implantable, that are being used in research, may be collecting information. And although we can say it's de-identified till we're blue in the face, IT wants to triple confirm that, right? So they don't, yes.
Also on these devices that they send you, like the iPad, so whatever's on that iPad has to be printed out and also cleared with regulatory. So you think that it would all be taken care of sometimes because it was on a device sent to you approved, but that doesn't mean it's taken care of for regulatory.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so that's another tidbit, it's the patient facing. I see my IRB peeps there. It's right. It's so anything that's being put in front of the patient needs to be IRB approved. The IRB needs to know. And so we, the diaries or these, now these like Samsung phones that these patients are taking, to rural parts of West Virginia because it's an awesome technology. I mean, for the state of West Virginia, a lot of this stuff is amazing. I mean, we can get data and compliance increased by using them, but then that means that, we need to know what's being put in front of that patient. If they're 5 hours away in rural West Virginia and they're answering questions on a phone and we haven't got that IRB approved, and some of the companies, that's just another side note, but we all know you've all worked with companies that are very well organized, industry sponsored companies that are very well organized, or maybe so big that it actually makes it more cumbersome, or so small that they're not very well organized, and you feel like you're the ones telling them how to do, no, we need a regulatory binder. So there's these companies from this, here to here on the spectrum, and we all have to figure it out at the end of the day because we're doing this with patients. So so that's a good point. No. Yep. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. So Raquel had pointed out that with these devices there's information, like if we're consenting on an iPad or doing data collection on an iPad with a questionnaire, or a patient diary. So Raquel recently realized that all of that needs IRB approval because it's basically considered patient-facing material. So just like you would give them a paper consent that needs IRB approved or a paper questionnaire for their quality of life, the same goes for screenshots from the devices. And we've had some issues, I don't know if you all have, with getting information from the sponsors on exactly what is being presented on those devices. It just, again, it depends on the company. Some of the smaller companies don't even realize that that's an issue. Like, well, but it just walks the patient through. Yeah, but we need to be able to tell the IRB, like, we know what they're going to see. We don't want some crazy thing flashing up on the screen that just traumatized a patient or something, you know, and then now we're responsible. So, yep, good point. And departments impacted. So that goes back to if you're going to be bringing on something that is impacting another department, like for the cath lab and for us, the cath lab and the OR staff, we have to figure out the process how to get the devices down. So we're all used to Lisa Giblin-Sutton for research drug, right? She does everything for us. Like, it's awesome. She shows up with the drugs, she does the inventory, she controls everything. We do our studies for drug studies. For devices, it's all on us. Like, we have to figure out the process. We have to work with the OR team, the cath lab team. When are the devices going to be brought down? You don't want to, again, leave them down there. They have to be locked up. We have some standard of care devices. They have a simple little sticker on them that says they're for the research study, but it very well, if the box is flipped over and somebody grabs it for a standard of care case, and now we've just, again, put that in a non-research patient. So all of that has to be worked out when you're bringing these devices in, because, again, the repercussions for putting a medical device in someone that didn't sign informed consent is pretty big. So we want to make sure that we don't do that. So we just started erring on informing everyone. They probably get sick of us, but we do walkthroughs, we do in-services. Somebody pop up. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. Fong, one of our research coordinators, is asking, and maybe the IRB can weigh in on this. Is there an e-consent SOP for e-consent? Like, if we have an iPad that they want us to consent on an iPad, do we have I'm putting you on the spot. Okay. Okay. So I need to repeat that. Okay. Explain how. Okay. Okay. So Sarah has told us that there is currently a committee that is working on the overall process for e-consent. So that's a work in progress. However, right now, if we did have something like an iPad that we would want to consent a patient on, we just need to get file for a waiver of documentation of consent and then outline the procedure that we'll be using to obtain the informed consent discussion and document the informed consent discussion via the iPad or whatever other device is being used. So to answer Fong's question, yes, we have a way to accommodate that now, and then there'll be a larger policy coming out at some point. Okay, so if it's a flex submission through KC, it's automatically granted the waiver of consent documentation. But for anything typically device related for us, or even drug, that's not going to be viable. Good? Okay. All right. So, right. Good point. Thank you. So expiration dates on devices. Devices do expire. And we also don't want to put an expired device in somebody. And some sponsors are better about alerting us and saying, hey, you've got the following devices that are going to expire. Here's a bunch of boxes. Can you ship those back? And then we'll ship you some new ones. That I would say that's probably not the majority. The majority of the time we have to track inventory. We have to be aware of the expiration dates. We have to have processes in place to make sure that we're tracking those on a regular basis, and that we make sure, and as you know, so medical devices can have various sizes, and they have to have multiple sizes available on a case day. So if they're implanting a valve per se, the valves can have different sizes. So we need to make sure we have 2 of every size, because oftentimes they don't know what size they're going to use until they actually go into the case. And you never want just one, because we all know what happens there. If something doesn't work well, or there's a tear in it or something, then that's the only one you have in that size. For other types of devices, the launchers and the disposables, we always have, obviously extras on hand. So expiration dates fall into that. So you could have maybe, 20 items associated with a device case, and then 2 of all of that, and then expiration dates on all of that. And that goes into the accountability. And then one other thing I did want to mention too, no cost POs. So oftentimes how we get devices into the system requires no cost PO. So it's a no cost purchase order. It really depends on the contract, but if it is a study that has that, there's a whole process in place for that. So you have to have the no cost PO in order for shipping and receiving to actually receive the device, because they don't want to receive anything that they don't have a purchase order for. And then you have to make sure that they don't open the box and mix it, with everything else, and that it gets back to you. And then when you use those devices, the process that you have to have with the sponsor to get those devices replaced. And if you've got, 3 patients in a week and you've just used, a lot of your inventory, you have to, it often feels like you're running kind of a not retail store, but, we do a lot of inventory work. And making sure that with upcoming cases, or they just added 2 cases and 2 patients consented today, and we still haven't received the shipment for the replacements from last week's case. So these are all things that you have to think about. Whereas if it's drug, Lisa Gimlin-Sutton does all that, and she just makes it all happen. Yes. There should be.
On that side, the expiration of drugs, use accounting for all of that.
Right.
That's not really fair. All of that. Have somebody manage that beyond.
So you just gave me my #1 task for 2020. No, it's great. No, we've been just flying like everyone else is with all the growth here, that we're just making things happen in the moment. It's on my radar. I'm having conversations with a lot of the areas that we're tapping for that specific thing, is to say, how can we as a system, and I don't want to just be WV medicine, the whole anybody doing device research, there should be a clear pathway for what you need to do if you want to bring a device into this. And I think I know there isn't one. There's pockets of things but no cohesive group yet. So it is, I've been having a lot of conversations to make that happen. And that also brings up a point too. I know in Encore has typically been an oncology setup, right? So it was really built for oncology studies. So we are starting Encore and we are putting device studies in there, but there is a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense for a device study. And so, just working out like, okay, well, what field can we'll just know if we use this field, what it means to us kind of thing, because it's really not built for device trials. So things like inventory could be, it would be great if we could do this in Encore and have this functionality that it helps us do that just like it does for protocol deviations or drug or anything like that. But it's not set up that way. So maybe I'll have a conversation with the Encore folks too. When they were here, we actually, I think, had mentioned device, and it's not on their priority. They have too much business the way it is. So I don't know that devices isn't a big enough market maybe, or, pressing enough. It is a big enough market, but is it pressing enough for them as a huge entity to actually make those significant changes? So hoping that we can develop a system, and, the more involved in that conversation, the merrier, because we certainly don't have all the answers and are just trying to make sure that things move forward. Let's see. So then we go on, we get initiated and trained. The sponsor comes, so similar to when sponsors come for drug studies, they always want to see our device storage areas. They want to check out who has access. They've typically already done that in the pre-qualification visit, but they'll do it again at site activation. They'll come say, okay, we shipped you a bunch of devices. Where are they? Where's your EKG machine? Has it been cleared by biomed? So they'll check all that at initiation and training. Oftentimes with devices, the investigators need to go somewhere for training, because some of these are not standard of care procedures, or the way they're launching a valve. So some sponsors require them to fly to their headquarters so that they can do like mock procedures in the lab. Some of them need to be proctored. So a lot of device studies, especially, you'll find more kind of in interventional cardiology and EP. You'll see where investigators have to be proctored for 1 or 2 or 3 cases by a physician that's well versed in that procedure. So they'll send a physician for the first X number of cases before they'll allow that investigator to do them non-proctored. And oftentimes they'll only allow 1 or 2 implanters or operators. Not necessarily every surgeon will get to be on a valve procedure case or a fib case, because the sponsor has said we're only allowing 2 operators. We're only comfortable. And if you think about it, it's the sponsor's way of closing that, the error, right? And really ensuring that their operators do the same thing the same way at every case, at every institution. So they don't want oftentimes 7 cardiac surgeons doing it, because they can't ensure that there's not a lot of variability. So those are the constraints of the study. It's industry sponsored. That's what that is. So you just, oftentimes physicians are upset. I get it. Everybody wants, to be a part of it, but sometimes, it's up to the sponsor to say that. So a lot of the training is happening, either prior or just at site initiation. We do a lot of walkthroughs with the OR teams and the cath lab teams, especially with like our early feasibility study. And I know there's some other big early feasibility studies that are happening on campus, like in neuro and stuff. And like, it's like game day. You're like, everybody's like doing walkthroughs and everything, because it's, not been done before. And so you've rehearsed it and you want to make sure you've said the same thing 60 times so that everybody's ready to go on that day. And so then you're up and running and you're enrolling patients. And then just on an ongoing basis, all the tracking that we all do, monitoring, screening numbers and all of that, but tracking devices, device accountability. How do you reorder devices? What if they wasted some devices? What if they attempted but a device didn't load, so they had to waste that device. What if the patient dies? We've had that. Patient has died and the sponsors requested the device back. So we have to work with pathology, and we have to work with we have to work with all the teams involved in that to get that device retrieved from that patient. And then we have to ship it back to the sponsor. So all those things that happen as you're doing the study, if there was a malfunction in the device, how is that handled? Most of the medical device companies have a clinical field rep that is really a clinical, typically, they know these devices inside and out, and a lot of them are, come to the cases. They can also help troubleshoot with the clinicians. They've been in, probably thousands of some of these cases because they travel across all the sites that are doing them. But then what do you need to have in place to be able to have these people, in the OR and in the cath lab and all of that? But most of them have a good relationship with the clinicians already, so they're really kind of part of the WVU family. But they're often the ones that can really be useful to our research staff in that moment of, especially early on in the study when you're not quite sure how this is going to go because they've been involved in it. Documentation in Epic, obviously anything that goes in a patient, everything has to be documented in Epic. If there's recalls, how are those handled? We just had recently with one of our studies, it's actually 3 studies, there was an issue with these pads or something that was related, and then we had to submit that to the IRB, and then we had to have verbal conversations with the subjects to let them know that there was a potential, although there was no increase in safety, but it was still, there was like not a third check that was done or something, so they felt that they needed to tell the patients that. So you have to call however many patients you have and have the PI have a conversation with them. And then we get to closing out the study. Things obviously to think about. What do you have to send back? Oftentimes we just have to send back the actual research device. Disposables and consumables, if we have those left over, oftentimes they don't care. It's kind of like lab kits and that kind of stuff. They don't want that stuff back. But obviously devices, they want those back. Some CRAs will come on site and do final inventory with us because they want their CRAs to do it. Some of them just have us box stuff up and send us, tracking and all of that, and we send it. And then obviously just storing those files and making sure that we have any information if there was ever a recall or something like that, that we have a way to be able to identify those patients if we would ever have to contact them at a later time. Okay, so I'm actually just going to pass because I already talked about that. So that's really it. Medical device research. We've seen some really cool things come through. We've got some cool things coming through in the future too. There are a lot of pieces involved, but I don't think it's really any more than any other type of research. It's just different, right? And to Sarah's point, like there's not really, I think the thing that kind of one of the closing comments is there's really not a solid identified process for this. And we have just learned what we've learned by just asking tons of people's input and questions and including people, erring on the side of including departments as not, because the environment is changing at WV Medicine in the hospital with all the constraints that I won't say constraints, but all the layers that they're putting in place with IT and procurement and the loading dock and all of this. And so it is going to affect us in research, and it's going to affect our timetables. It's going to affect how quickly we can get research up and running. And not that like it's a race, but we certainly don't want to take 8 months to get a study up. That's, we'd like to be able to get these things going and get those patients enrolled so that they can get the care, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day, is they are bringing life-saving measures to these patients, and we want to be able to, have our patients have access to that.